Hey there, we're the Westlot Pirates and welcome to the show. We're here to share our thoughts on Northwestern athletics and college sports, with thoughts and analysis from the visceral to the statistical. We run our tailgate with the red pirate flag flying high above, as we give no quarter, especially the fourth. I'm Sam Walter.
I'm John Lacombe.
And I'm Eric Scuzz, crab cakes and football scousebo.
Oh, that's what Maryland does. Hell yeah. Tonight we are here to talk about Maryland. No longer the new kid on the block. I know I made that same joke with Rutgers, but they've been in the Big Ten a minute now. So I feel like we've seen Maryland quite a bit. Like, we just talked about Indiana where we never see them, but I feel like we do a Maryland preview like all the time when it comes to Northwestern. This is a team that is coming off a decent season last year, 8-5. 8-5 the year before, 7-6. I mean, they've gone to bowl games in several consecutive years.
Taulia Tongavaloa.
Well, that is definitely a factor, which is no longer in effect here. But John, let's talk about the Maryland D. What do you make of it?
Well, so defensive side of the ball, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse because I've been talking about this. I hate to keep dumping on Michigan State, who is a program that we have no particular hatred or even dislike for, but it's a strange time for them to have gone into the tank defensively because, again, we talked about how strange that is over the long-term history of the pod, but kind of in a minor vein of the same thing, like other traditionally weak defensive teams from the old Big Ten East have decided to play very solid defensive football lately. And we talked about Rutgers being one of them, and now we can talk about Maryland, who to a lesser extent is another one. So a lot was made over this quote unquote swoon that the Terps had in the second half of last season. But let's keep it a buck. Maryland lost one game that people expected them to win, and that was by 3 points to Illinois on a field goal as time expired. Their other four losses down that stretch were Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State, and altogether now a good-as-hell Northwestern Wildcats team. Maryland didn't ever get bad. They just played four good teams, and they lost. This team smoked Rutgers, they smoked Indiana, they smoked Michigan State, they smoked Virginia, and they smoked Auburn in a bowl game. The Terps were good. And again, we beat them because 2023 Northwestern Wildcats were effing sweet. Never forget that. But anyway, the Maryland defense. Quite solid by Maryland standards, and it has been for a couple of years now. So remember, Maryland used to be wet trash on this side of the ball. And
I was just thinking it wasn't that long ago when we said the Maryland defense and you just busted out laughing and we couldn't stop you laughing for 5 minutes.
Absolutely not good. But real talk, there might not be a more underrated defensive coordinator in the Big Ten right now than Brian Williams, and he might be right at the top of that list because you probably don't even know that name, Brian Williams. And this guy's done a great job at Maryland. For the past
when he wasn't moonlighting hosting NBC News?
Yeah, it's different Brian Williams, if you can believe
okay,
it.
Okay.
Now, Brian Williams might say that he was the defensive coordinator at Maryland, but now I'm running back old Brian Williams jokes. I digress. So, in any case, this Brian Williams, for the past 2 years, has presided over a solidly middle-of-the-pack defense, which, again, for a team starting Taulia on the other side of the ball was pretty damn great. But Williams deserves massive kudos this year for keeping this D afloat because of the turnover he was dealing with last year. So basically, the entire success of the defensive unit in 2022 was based on the performance that Williams, who had been the Terps defensive line coach prior to getting the DC job, coaxed out of 5 enormous dudes who rotated across the front of that 3-4 defense. And then last year, all 5 of those guys left, and Williams still fielded the number 8 scoring defense and number 7 total defense in the conference. And again, I want to stress, this is really good work. Maryland basically lucked into Williams after their whole defensive coordinator hiring process imploded 2 years ago. And Williams looks like the real deal. And just like the year before, Williams somehow managed to build the team front to back. So a lot has been made about Maryland putting multiple defensive backs into the NFL over the past 2 years, but it's not like Maryland hasn't done that before. And there's previously been this disconnect between those guys being good and the actual defense being good at Maryland, What keyed the Terps last year was that big boy transfers Quashon Fuller and Jordan Phillips paired with Tommy Akingbasote up front to make Maryland go. Williams rebuilt the entire front in a single year. And you're not going to see it show up on the stat sheet because this is a 3-4 defensive lineman, and 3-4 defensive linemen tend to do the dirty work that's not reflected in the stats. But not unlike Illinois, at least up until last season, like let's say relatively recent Illinois history, Maryland found some real strength across the front, defensive line of a 3-4 scheme. This team only gave up 125 rush yards a game last year. And that's a big deal because Maryland gets all of those big boys back this year. They don't turn over the defensive line. Again, they lose a bunch of solid defensive backs, including Tarheeb Still, to the Chargers. The loss they'll likely feel the most in the secondary, though, is safety Bo Braid in the run game, because this linebacker core is really not much to write home about. It's certainly possible that the pass defense could drop off this year due to less quality cover men like Still, but Williams does a pretty decent job finding sacks here and there across this defense with scheme. Again, this guy's a pretty good coach. Is this a perfect defense? No. Is it even a great defense? No. It just doesn't have a ton going on in the back seven, especially against the run, but it's very tough up front across the defensive line, and it's very well coached. Here's where we should stop. Again, respect is respect. Appreciate that Brendan Sullivan gave us 2 years of really good football against this defense. Now either Mike Wright or Jack Lausch is going to have to step up. And more importantly, the Trench Cats are going to have to solve the type of 3-4 scheme that has traditionally given us a lot of problems over the past couple of years. And they've got to get Joseph Hyman and Cam Porter to the second level of this defense where they can slice up what, again, should be a pretty weak back seven. And hopefully, if that all comes together this far into the season, that can be a recipe for success in our first, I guess you'd say, traditional Big Ten road game of the year.
Scuzz, I just got some breaking news here. Taulia Tagovailoa is not playing for Maryland this year?
Correct.
Whoa.
His requested waiver for I believe 6th or 7th year of eligibility was denied.
Wow, he doesn't
because he tried
to. He doesn't just get emeritus status there. Yeah, no, that's right. He tried to come back.
He did try. Yeah.
So didn't work out.
What are they doing offensively?
Well, I'm starting to feel like this is just the way it is at every school at this point, but it is a season of change for Maryland. You mentioned Taulia. He is now with the Hamilton Tiger Cats in the CFL. They only have one returning offensive lineman. They have a key loss at wide receiver. But honestly, aside from the Taulia of it all, that's really not far from what this team was facing in 2023. So it's a bit of a familiar territory, but they are starting over quite clearly. A very entertaining quote from the Phil Steele magazine. Given that Maryland only has one returning starter on offensive line. Quote, "The career starts fall to just 21, but Loxley likes the depth and is not as concerned as I am." So Phil Steele is right. This is likely a problem for Maryland. But they were in the exact same place last year with only one returning starter. So no wonder Loxley isn't that concerned. He's thinking, oh yeah, we just did this last year. Last year's new offensive line did improve on the catastrophic 2022 sack rate. I think a lot of that is just due to Taulia and his comfort and getting better back there, evading the rush, extending plays. The offensive line was way less effective run blocking. The rush yards per game last year were down from 141 in 22 to only 108 yards rushing per game.
Wow.
That was with a really good running back in Roman Hemby. Taulia, for his part, was just as good last year as he was the year before. He weathered the loss of top receiver Raheem Jarrett pretty effectively, but he was totally unable to improve the offense in any way in his final year. And so what will this offense look like in 2024? Like I said, the offensive line is in similar footing. They're probably going to have some struggles. There's going to be some growing pains, especially with a new quarterback. They do have Roman Hemby. He's back at running back, and they add a potential impact freshman in Nolan Ray. Hemby, averaged 5 yards of carry. He only ran for 680 yards, but he only had 142 attempts. Like, this was a very pass heavy team last year. I don't see how they can be that again with the change at QB. We'll have to see. They do lose their top receiver, but they retain the number 2 guy, Ty Felton, and the number 3, and Caden Prather. All 3 of these guys put up really similar stats last year, like 14 to 15 yards per catch. Like, they were all, we'll call them intermediate to deep threats. So they still have a lot to work with in the receiver core, even with the loss of top guy Deshaun Jones, who's been with them for a number of years. But, like, real talk, Taulia Tagovailoa was the straw that started the drink at Maryland for, going back to 2020. And the last 3 seasons, they were scratching at 30 points a game. And prior to that were, more like in the low 20s, albeit one really good season in 2018. So I like this is with the reduced effectiveness of the running game last year, the continued turnover at offensive line that they're not going to really be able to build on that. It's really concerning. Now at the same time, Taulia skipped the bowl game and Maryland thumped Auburn. The quarterbacks that played in that game had a great first half and then didn't look so good in the second half. They add MJ Morris this year. He's the presumed starter. He played 4 games last season at NC State. Was not that great, but he also played pretty difficult competition in those 4 games. He faced Duke, Miami, and Clemson. But he has enormous shoes to fill. And if it's not him, they've got Billy Edwards and Cameron Edge. These are the 2 guys that filled in last year in the bowl game that were decent. Like, neither one of these guys has much pedigree, and they're going to they are going to be the backups this year in some order. So I mean, like, the quarterback room is greatly diminished. Full stop, greatly diminished, and I just don't see how this offense can come close to their numbers the last 3 years. Now, Loxley might not be worried, and some of that might be bravado. Some of that might be like he's a super experienced head coach. He's seen everything everywhere. He's got a good defensive coordinator in Josh Gaddis, who you might remember won the Broyles Award when he was at Michigan in 21. I don't see, unless Morris absolutely blows us all away, like unless he comes in and is just like lights out the most impressive newcomer to the Big Ten, with his his development from what we've seen on the field previously and his command of the offense, I just cannot fathom this team coming close to their production last year in the passing game. And then I don't see their ability to create the space or the power to drive the running game. I mean, again, the offensive line is all but one guy are starting over. It's not a super talented room on paper, and it just feels like this offense can't go anywhere but backwards from last season.
If you or a loved one is seriously injured by someone else's negligence, hire Kent Simpson of the Simpson Law Group. After over a decade prosecuting murder cases in Chicago, Simpson opened his own firm focused on wrongful death and personal injury cases. He specializes in car, truck, motorcycle, boat, and other transportation accidents, as well as construction accidents, medical negligence, slip and falls, product liability, and more. Millions recovered for clients, no fee unless he wins. The Simpson Law Group, compassion, empathy, and vigorous advocacy. Go to simpsonlawgroup.com or call 312-332-2107 for a free consultation, and go Cats. So running through their schedule, they open up the season at home against Connecticut and Michigan State. Then they're at Virginia, home for Villanova, at Indiana, then they get their bye week. They host us coming off the bye, then they host a USC, then they go to Minnesota, have another bye before they go to Oregon. Home for Rutgers, home for Iowa, and finish off the season at Penn State.
So one thing that I had seen maybe a week or two ago was that Loxley is getting pretty fair odds in like coach fired odds this year.
What is that? That's like there's all this noise around Loxley. Like, why?
So a couple things. One, I think part of it would be, I guess if there was a feeling that's like, look, like we saw the Taulia Tagovailoa era, that represents the ceiling based on everything a reasonable person would think, and certainly everything Scuzz just measured out. That totally a believable scenario. And if you're like, look, like new era, time to turn the page. But part of it, and I wonder if maybe this is why maybe the Sharps are zooming in on this, is if you look at this schedule on a week-by-week basis, it's totally possible Maryland could lose their last 8 games of the season. A situation that snowballs. Scuzz, we just did the Indiana preview, and Scuzz painted a potentially rosy picture for that Indiana offense. Now, again, maybe Maryland just thumps them, just because, like, Maryland's, at least last season they thumped a bunch of teams, right? But if, like, it's the kind of thing where we talked about this when we talked about, again, with Indiana and, like, the implosion of what Tom Allen had built defensively there, right? It's like when you don't just have a ton of talent or a ton of history on one side of the ball, and then you're used to getting a massive helping hand from the offense, and then you suddenly don't get that helping hand anymore, like, sometimes things can go really squirrely. And like I said, like, Maryland had a very solid defense last year, and I like their coaching, but it's not loaded with talent, especially in the back seven. And how can any of us predict that? It's like, again, like, Taulia Tagovailoa was one of the best players in the Big Ten for, 4 years?
Well, he's the leading passer in Big Ten history,
right?
Career-wise.
Which is wild,
right? Yeah. Like, so, John, I want to hit on that thumping teams last year, because I think it's really important. Like, the teams they thumped, Michigan State, Indiana, and Rutgers, were, I think, arguably the 3 teams that had the most disastrous situation at quarterback. That thumping might be more a product of those teams and what they were incapable of doing.
And we always used to preview those teams and be like, look, when in doubt, one of these teams has Taulia and one of them doesn't.
Exactly. And then, like, Nebraska, they barely beat Nebraska because Nebraska's got a good defense. But Nebraska could only score 10 points on Maryland because they were playing a running back at quarterback.
Converted linebacker. Well,
yeah, I think when you scrutinize last year, it puts even just a little bit more doubt. And I think people are just looking at, it's exactly what you said. Nobody's looking at this team and being able to envision a way in which Loxley builds on the success he had over the last 3 seasons. And they're thinking, like, well, if that was the ceiling, we need to, like, this conference just changed dramatically, right? It just got a lot harder. And even though, they don't have to play Ohio State or Michigan this year for the first time since they've been in the conference, much like Rutgers, but they still get Maryland, Iowa, USC,
There's like this narrative piece too, because as we said earlier, it's like, look, they lost a bunch of games down the stretch last year. A ton of those games, realistically, like, they're forgivable losses. But if you think from a narrative perspective, it's like, boy, they lost a lot of games down the stretch last year, and they're sure losing a lot of games down the stretch this year. Yep. And, it's like you can see how that kind of thing would snowball.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. This is Maryland. This is not like Alabama. This is not like, USC dumping Lane Kiffin on the tarmac. I mean, this is not a team. This is not a program that has this traditional blue bloodness that is like that can be whining about 5 consecutive bowl games. I mean, it's a program that's in the upper half of the conference. I mean, maybe.
Well, the conference just changed, so like I think that would be the counter argument, Sam. But
sure, but why do you make that change then?
Well, you're spot on, because this is the Glenn Mason experience at Minnesota.
Yeah,
I mean, look at what Maryland has done the last 3 seasons. Destroyed their super easy non-conference, and then picked up like a couple wins in conference, and ended up in a bowl game with a winning record by a couple wins. And Glenn Mason got turfed because he couldn't get beyond that ceiling and contend in the conference in any meaningful way. He couldn't beat Wisconsin. He couldn't beat Michigan. Maryland hasn't beaten any, they put the fear into Michigan a couple times. They put the fear into Ohio State once, but they haven't taken any of those big wins. They haven't come close to Penn State, which is interesting given those other two I just mentioned. So it does feel like the potential here is topped out, and if this were year 4 of Loxley, I think it would be different. But this is year 6, and I if you're not seeing real evolution and development and growth of the roster and of the fundamentals of this team. I mean, starting over at offensive line every year, like this team's effed if that's the MO on top of defense is fine and we got an okay quarterback, but unless they can reproduce. I mean, they pulled Taulia from Alabama. They didn't recruit him out of high school, right? So I don't know. I could totally understand why the brass would be looking at this situation and saying shit.
But here's where I'm bumping against is who can you bring in that is going to take Maryland to the next level? And what is the next level? Like competing for the playoff, right? I mean, what does that look like?
I mean, I think there's a really good chance that they don't have a particularly great season this year, but they don't fire Mike Loxley for that exact reason. But I mean, it could go either way.
Indiana just hired Kurt Signetti. I mean, would you have said the exact same thing about Tom Allen a year and a half ago? That who could Indiana possibly bring in that can top the Tom Allen experience?
But the difference is Indiana had been bad for the last
that's
seasons.
the thing.
Maryland has been decent. I mean, Maryland they've been going to bowl games every year. You got to think of you got to be realistic about expectations here, especially when you're bringing in 4 new teams to the conference. What are the expectations at Maryland? They're different than the expectations at Ohio State. They're different than the expectations at Michigan. They have to be.
Well, maybe I should couch this another way. They ain't going 8-5 this year.
Yeah,
they're going 6-6 at best.
Yeah, fair. And it's funny to juxtapose. I mean, I suppose one thing to talk about is we're going to be in College Park. Last time we were in College Park, I mean, think of it this way, right? I mean, you mentioned they still got Roman Hemby, and we all remember what Roman Hemby did to us 2 years ago in College Park and how rough that was. But at the same, and you could also be and hey, Taulia didn't play in that game because he was hurt for that game, and they played their backup quarterback, and it's yeah, but you have to think where we were as a football team.
We lost to Miami of Ohio's backup quarterback that year too.
Right. And specifically where we were as a defensive front relative to what Hemby did in that game and just how drastic the change was the year after. I think this is 2 different football teams. And again, props to Maryland. I don't think their defense is going to be a pushover by any stretch of the imagination. And yes, we don't have at least who last year, Maryland killer Brendan Sullivan, who had his best game of the year against Maryland last year. But again, Maryland just loses so much, including a generational player at quarterback. And I just don't feel like all the other pieces are in place to somehow magically account for that. I like us in this game. I like our ability to get to the second level of this defense. I like our ability. If we've got the quarterback situation well squared at this point, I like our ability to throw on this defense, and I feel really good about our defense's chance to handle Hemby, despite as good as he is, because they're not going to have the kind of dynamic offense that they have in the past. I feel good about this game, even though it's on the road.
Now, speaking of Brendan Sullivan, maybe he'll get a chance to have another Maryland game playing for Iowa on November 23rd.
Yeah, truth.
So what are we thinking here?
I mean, I like 6-6 is the ceiling to me because Penn State, Iowa, Rutgers, Oregon, USC. That's 5 losses, and I cannot see them winning any of those games. Honestly, I mean, and then I don't think they're gonna sweep the rest. So whether it's dropping at Indiana, losing to us, losing at Minnesota, honestly, probably more than one of those. I like them in their first 4, but
that's Virginia though. I mean, Virginia might be decent.
And
Yeah,
again,
so, I mean, they could
thumped,
be-
they thumped Virginia last year, right? But it's a different world. Yeah.
So I mean, the floor is like 4-8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
somewhere,
and if they
yeah.
go 4-8 and they lose, 6 of their last 7, Loxley is 100% getting fired.
For sure. For sure. I just, if they have a bad year, I can definitely see them, wanting to move on. But like, if they have a decent year, like, I just can't see. I cannot justify firing Mike Loxley after another 8-5 season.
Oh yeah,
It's not gonna happen,
if they pull together a winning season after losing Taulia and 4 of their offensive line starters, like, oh yeah, 100% they should continue the experiment, because then he can build on it, right? I just don't think there's any world in which that's plausible or probable.
I think, I'm somewhere between 5-6, 5-7, 6-6. Maybe 6-6. Again, that Minnesota game is interesting. That's going to be a battle of 2 teams that have a lot of warts but really good running backs.
I mean, the best player on the field by quite a margin in that game is Darius Taylor.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, I think 5-7. I think Loxley's going to keep his job, but I think, they're not going to be good, and 6-6 might be, like Scott said, as high as they get.
Anything else to mention about the Terps?
No, let's find someone else to find some magic. Again, props. We're not going to get too many chances to say it. Like, props to Brendan Sullivan. He was really good against this football team. He beat him once. He almost beat him twice. And he was excellent against the Terps last year. So, shouts to Brendan.
Well, on that note, we'll go ahead and leave it there for tonight. Head to our website, westlawnpirates.com, where you can leave comments and questions. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. And you can always email the show, westlawpirates@gmail.com. Tune in next time as we give our visceral and statistical views on Northwestern athletics, and look for us in the west lot of Ryan Field flying the red pirate flag, because we give no quarter, especially the fourth. For John Lacombe and Eric Scasbo, I'm Sam Walter. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.